Everyone, at our second to last video talking about the models of economic development. So essentially looking at how it is that countries become developed. So there are two general ideas here, optimistic theory and pessimistic theory. Just based on the terms optimist and pessimist, we're talking here about a first theory of optimism, thinking that there is in fact a way for a country to become more developed over time. More specifically, optimistic theory of development is related to the idea that there are plenty of resources in terms of fossil fuels and alternative sources of energy. They're just simply unevenly distributed. That actually is reminiscent of what we talked about in the population unit when we talked about Thomas Malthus versus cornucopians. Let's break down that idea though. Fossil fuels are specifically the energy sources that come when plants and animals have been buried over millions of years, and those the animal bones and the plant itself, that when they are decomposed, ultimately that will lead to sources of energy, and those are called fossil fuels. Some examples of that would be coal, oil, and natural gas. Unfortunately, those are limited in our world, so people are consistently looking for alternative sources of energy, things like ethanol, things like solar power, things like water power. And the optimistic theory says that there's plenty of these, they're just simply not distributed evenly. So the optimistic theory of development is going to encourages countries to use capitalism, to use the system that is going to allow the most qualified country, or most qualified people to access those resources and in turn distribute them throughout the country. Pessimistic theory of development says there's simply we just can't get to the resources themselves. There's too many challenges, and that are going to prevent a country from becoming developed. In other words, their inability to access these resources is going to negatively impact their ability to develop over time. Some examples that are posed in the pessimistic theory is that the population is growing, so we're going to need more resources. Even if there currently are enough, the population growth is going to prevent us from effectively utilizing those resources. People also say that the pessimistic theory that the LDCs don't have the markets or the capital to drive investment. In other words, that we looked at this in that video about China, that the idea that there may be an opportunity to make money, but without people who are able to buy that good, without people who are able to specifically purchase something, then you have no market, whether or not you are industrialized or not. There's also the idea of the multiplier effect, that if there isn't development in that country, then a new business isn't going to come to a place that doesn't have development. It's much more profitable and easy for them to go somewhere that already has development and infrastructure. And lastly, the pessimistic theory says that investment is only occurring in certain areas of the world. So optimistic theory is saying that there are ways for countries to become more developed over time. Pessimistic theory is just like the idea of a pessimist, not so hopeful that the countries can become developed. But let's look at ways that that countries can become developed over time. We first need to start about applying, again, we're going to revisit this idea of the core and periphery model, because the core and periphery model helps us also understand the dynamics that are occurring within a given country. So the core periphery model can also describe regions within a country. For example, within a country there can be an industrial core, so rather than just the core areas of the world as you see up there can be an industrial core of a given place. So for example, in the United States, we're talking about the northeastern corridor. We're talking about the south, the growing Sun Belt development. That can be the industrial core. Let me back myself up. Industrial core is the northeastern corridor. In the United States, what our upward transition zone would be considered the south, because they were gaining more jobs and attracting more industry. This can occur within a country itself. There can be regions that are downward transition regions that are losing industry and losing resources, net out migration. I'm talking about the Rust Belt. Looking here at the deindustrialization faced by central England, a lot of the areas of France, a little bit into Germany as well. And there's also the resource frontier, which is the area that provides the resources for the industrial core through transportation systems. So the areas that have the pipelines, the trains, the planes, the ships to get the resources to the industrial core. So that's just going to look within a country, because we're going to talk about how those different regions can interact in order to propel the development of a country. So one of the key models of development is developed by Walter Rostow, which is his Rostow's model of development. development, Rostow's model of development, excuse me, which was developed in the 1960s. And this is the same thing as the international trade model. We talked about the self-sufficiency model in class, the idea that you close off the borders for the most part, and you focus on internal development, and requires a very large government, often faced by a lot of corruption because of that massive bureaucratic system that's going to be developed. The world systems model is really the idea that the Rostows model of development is really the idea that a country, it's 5 stages to explain a country's development. The world systems theory, let's compare and contrast for a second. That model we talked about with the core, semi-periphery, and periphery model, that's the idea that a core country becomes developed because it exploits the resources of the periphery countries. The world systems theory is really more World systems theory is the core, periphery, semi-periphery model, that the core is becoming developed by exploiting the resources of the periphery. The Rostows model is really focused on the internal development of a country, and it's focusing not so much on how a country depends upon others. There's no dependency with Rostows model as there is with the world systems theory. So Rostow says that there are 5 stages of this modernization, that a country is always progressing forward. In contrast, world systems theory, a core country or a semi-periphery country can change. It's much more fluid. In the Rostow's model, it's a constant progress forward from a traditional society all the way to an age of mass consumption, and we'll talk about each one of these stages. First stage is the traditional society. So traditional society, there's no countries that are very few societies on the whole that are consistently all in this traditional society. Very comparable to stage 1 of the demographic transition model. That the country is entirely based upon subsistence living, agricultural economy, very limited trading, very limited technology, very limited worldview, really just focused on the day-to-day existence within the society. Does this apply to some very, very remote, let's say, island nations, perhaps in the Pacific Rim region? Sure, but on the whole, very few societies would fall under this traditional society. Very few countries at all. Alternative, and I'm sorry, there's a little typo here. Let's get this to number 2. And our second stage is going to be the preconditions for takeoff stage. And the preconditions for takeoff, I actually like this terminology because it's very logical. Precondition for takeoff stage says that the country is going to start developing manufacturing, and they're going to start to develop a national outlook. They're going to start to consider the world beyond their own individual existence and start to intertwine their lives with the people around them. It's no longer just a regional outlook or regional existence. It's kind of thinking of it like people are starting to pick their head up and looking at their nation as a whole or their country as a whole, and they're going to start developing manufacturing in a very limited capacity. Again, preconditions for takeoff. The society is not yet growing, not yet developed, but the seeds are there. Third stage is the very short period of time known as the takeoff stage. This is a very short period of intense growth in which industrialization occurs. Workers and institutions and industry are all focused primarily on one specific type of industries. That's the idea of the takeoff stage, is that the country has found what it can do well and what industry will drive the rest of its development. This often happens because countries find what's called their comparative advantage. And again, their comparative advantage, we talked about this before, is the idea that the country has something that they do better, they do more cheaply, that they have access to, that they have something that their country will that what their country can provide in a successful way, that either other countries must depend upon them for, or simply other regions. So the idea here is that the comparative advantage, comparatively speaking, that country will have an advantage. That's the idea of the comparative advantage. An example of that, and I'm coming right back here, is the coffee industry in Central America. You can see, look at the top map there, is the number of countries that are producing, or the areas of the world, like sort of all along the equatorial zone of the world. They have the conditions necessary for coffee growth. You can't grow coffee in the middle of Connecticut, right? You need the tropical climate to do so. And you can see but look at the coffee consumption globally. Look at how that then compares that the MDCs of the world and the developing countries of the world are the mass consumers of the coffee, whereas these central equatorial regions are the mass producers of coffee. That's a comparative advantage. The MDCs are depending upon the LDCs for the production of this coffee. This industry has driven a lot of, is the takeoff stage, has driven the industrialization of many of the Central American or the Central American, but latitudes, the mid-latitude countries. Another example would be the Silicon Valley in California. Again, this is the comparative advantage. This is the agglomeration of a certain industry that then in turn drives the development of the rest of the area. Looking at the takeoff stage, people start to urbanize. We see the development of a secondary sector growth. So we're seeing the beginning of factories, the beginning of manufacturing. And ultimately, this is, again, a short period of time, because really what's going to be defined, what you and I think of a country that's developing is really, or the development of a country is a long process, and it's really defined in that fourth stage of the drive to maturity phase, which is the long stage. And this now development is starting to spread beyond the initial sector of development. So let's say, for example, that coffee industry was the comparative advantage. In the drive to maturity stage, we're seeing the development now trickle over and begin to develop what are the ancillary industries. So the hotels industries, the shipment industries, as the coffee industry grows, that might be able to provide greater educational opportunities. So the drive to maturity phase is the long period of time. We see the standards of living rise. We see service sector, even tertiary jobs start to emerge. So that's the longest stage of this model of development. The chart down there just shows you the general idea of the takeoff periods of time. You can see one of the problems. You can see the enormous difference in the takeoff period from Great Britain in the 1700s, which obviously makes sense when we talk about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and looking all the way down at India. And this is causing great conflict in modern day, because Great Britain, Russia, United States, Germany, many of these now what we call Western countries, basically had unhindered development. In other words, they just could develop in any way as quickly as they liked with no environmental restrictions, so on and so forth. And that led to that basically created the most developed countries of the world now. Well, now we have other countries such as China and India who are seeking to do the same for themselves, but facing great pressure from Western countries and to, for example, limit their population. Limit their pollution, not population. Limit their pollution and other sort of restrictions. So there's some tension there, because the early countries were able to go through their own drive to maturity with no real environmental consequences or restrictions, and now as countries do so, they're facing a lot of global pressure to limit that growth. Finally, what we have is considered the most developed, or the peak part of this model, which would be the age of mass consumption. So here what we have the mass consumption of moderately priced goods. We talked about in the beginning of this unit, we talked about the creation of mass production. So we got factories that can now mass produce goods. In the age of mass consumption, you have a society that can massively consume those goods, as opposed to shipping out those goods, as opposed to exporting those goods. You have a population who they themselves can consume those goods. So the characteristics of this society, you'd have a very large middle class. You'd have a very large secondary, tertiary sector economy. And the economy itself, as it says here, is driven by the consumption of the goods. So you've got people producing they've got people producing their own retail stores, and you've got people consuming those goods, right, all in the same society. Again, no dependency. No, this isn't world systems theory. You're not looking to other countries to consume your goods. You've got your own consumer base within your country. The entire economy is really based upon tertiary sector jobs. And a key example of the country that went straight through this model, we see this with the 4 Asian tigers. We see this in, as I already mentioned, historically with some of the most developed countries of the world. But here's a great example that of the Rostows model would be Singapore. The 4 Asian tigers used this model to find their comparative advantage, the development of electronics. Initially, the creation of shoes, but really now it's more the electronics industry, large labor force that was able to be used and to drive development, and that in turn led to a more developed society. So that, just keep repeating myself, but that multiplier effect and that growth effect. So that's Rostow's model, and here are the 2 analysis questions. For the second one, let me explain a little bit different here. a little bit what I mean. I want us to compare Rostow's model with the world systems analysis. I want to see how these two models of how a country becomes developed over time really compare with one another, because Rostow's really is about an individual country developing over time, where the world systems, again, that key phrase of systems, is all about the interconnectedness of the global world economy. So there's three specific components to that question. All right, thanks, guys.